infants at birth, I think this is a couple months of age, can distinguish equally between all human faces regardless of race, as well as primate faces. What? So the way that they do this, so this is a little deviation from that. Babies will always look at, when given a familiar object and a new object, they'll always go for the new object because they're all about learning and experiencing. They're new to the world and they're all about just finding the new thing. So what they do is they'll show a baby a picture of a familiar face, or they'll show it a couple times to make it familiar, and then they'll show it two faces. And if the baby looks at the new face, then we know that it can distinguish between them enough to say, okay, I've seen that one before, this is the new one, I'm going to look at this one. Does that make sense? So that's how we know that they can distinguish between those two things. So they can do that with faces of all races, but they can also do that with monkeys. So they would show this baby, this monkey to the baby a couple of times until it became familiar, and then show them two, and the baby would say, okay, well, I've seen that monkey before, I'm going to look at the new one. So we can say that these two faces are not that similar, right? I can definitely tell the difference between those two faces, but I can't tell the difference between these two monkeys, I just can't. But a baby can tell those two monkeys apart as easily as we can tell apart those two humans, which is pretty crazy. So obviously something has to happen between then and now because I can't tell the monkeys apart. I don't think you guys can tell the monkeys apart. So what happens is perceptual narrowing, which is when the baby starts out at having this perceptual set, but it narrows down through life because they don't get the different stimulation needed to keep that intact, I guess. So like it starts out with human and non-human primates, so human and monkey faces that they can distinguish between humans, they can distinguish between monkeys, but if a baby isn't raised by monkeys, then it doesn't get the constant exposure to monkey faces, so they lose that. Gets down to just human faces. And if they are raised, as most people are, in one specific race, or like the majority of one race, they will lose other races and have just the one that they were raised in. And the reason I have them getting bigger on the slide is that as they lose different abilities, so they lose monkeys, they lose different races, they do get better at the ones that they still have, the ones in their category. And they've also done more studies with macaw monkeys, and it follows the same pattern as that. So this is a specific study that they did on a group of babies. It was a couple years ago. So they tested them at 6 months, and they could distinguish, so what we were talking about with the human faces and then monkey faces, they could distinguish the humans and the monkeys. But at 9 months, after no exposure to monkeys and just humans, they lost that. So in a matter of 3 months, their brain kind of figured out, okay, I don't really need to recognize, to be able to identify monkeys. We'll focus on humans. And this is really, really interesting to me that the same process happens with people of different races. So this particular study, I think, was done in northern England. And so these were Caucasian babies with Caucasian families who were given, I'm not sure if it's no exposure to any other races or just really minimal, but at 3 months they could do Caucasian, Asian, and African faces. At 6 months they had lost African and it was just down to Caucasian and Asian. And then 3 months later, after that, at 9 months, they were just on Caucasian, which is pretty fascinating because you hear a lot of people, there's that, oh, I have a hard time recognizing people of this race, or these people all look the same, or whatever. And it's because that this is happening. It's not, there's a biological explanation for why that happens. Because if you were raised with, a family of one race or a community of generally one race, you don't need to have those other, I guess, superfluous ones, which we know they're not, but you get better at the one race that you're in. Okay, so this is kind interesting that that facial perception and perceptual narrowing, it kind of matches up the same way as language acquisition, so that's a good way to think about it. So with faces, to recap, all faces, both human and primate, down to human faces, down to a specific ethnicity or a couple ethnicities. Same with language, so everybody's born with the same potential to speak any language, but if you're raised in one or two languages, I guess, you lose all the other abilities and you focus on just your one language. And there have been studies done that, I think in, the one that I've heard about is Hindi. There's different tonal sounds that obviously people who speak Hindi can recognize because it's in their language, but if I heard it, I wouldn't be able to recognize even the difference between those two tones. And I remember, practical application, I had an exchange student my sophomore year, and she was from Norway, and she would try really hard to teach me Norwegian. It didn't really work out, because she would try to teach me like the difference between gold and yellow, which is gul and gul. And she would say it over and over, like, no, it's not gul, it's gul. And I'm sorry, and I would say, like, I'm really sorry, I'm not trying to be like a stupid American, but I can't hear the difference between that. I can't do it. So that's what's happened with language acquisition. That sort of mirrors the same thing that facial recognition does. So it's cool that those two things aren't really related per se, but they work the same way through child development. So I thought that was really cool and a good way to kind of wrap it up. And that's all I got for you.